The storm came without warning. Thunder rolled across the Appalachian Hollow like cannon fire, shaking the windows of the old farmhouse that leaned against the hillside. Inside, the air was thick, the smell of damp wood, candle wax, and fear. A woman was in labor, her moans swallowed by the storm. But those who remembered that night swore they never once heard her scream. The midwife, a woman named Ruth Carter, was summoned from 3 miles down the muddy road. She would later tell her daughter, and her daughter only, that what she saw that night wasn't human, but it was alive. She climbed the creaking stairs into the upstairs bedroom, where lantern light flickered against peeling wallpaper. The mother lay still, her face pale, her lips pressed shut. Beside her, the father paced, hands clenched, muttering under his breath. The delivery was swift, too swift. Ruth expected the cry of a newborn to rise above the storm. Instead, silence filled the room. She leaned closer, squinting in disbelief. The child had no eyes, no nose, just soft folds of skin where a face should have been. Yet it breathed, a shallow, rasping breath that filled the air with unease. Ruth gasped, and the father snapped his head toward her. His voice, trembling but forceful, hissed, "Say nothing." He wrapped the baby in a frayed quilt before the midwife could react. In her hands, the infant squirmed, warm and fragile, but she dared not look too long. Fear clawed at her chest. She knew at that moment she had witnessed something that would follow her until her dying day. Outside, villagers claimed they heard shouting above the storm. Some said it was the father, his voice cracking like the thunder itself. Others swore the house went silent, as if the walls themselves had swallowed the sound. But one detail appeared in every retelling. No one ever heard the mother's voice. Not that night. Not ever again. By morning, Ruth returned home in shock. She told no one, not even her husband, what she had seen. Yet words slipped out, carried by whispers. A baby born without a face. A curse on the family. God's punishment for sins buried too deep to name. Neighbors crossed the road when passing the farmhouse. Children were told not to stare at the windows, where sometimes a figure rocked slowly in the dark. The child lived. That much is certain, but not in the way others did. She was hidden, kept from view, her existence never written in church ledgers or county records. Outsiders asked questions, but doors remained shut. What should have been a tragedy became something else, a symbol. In that Appalachian Hollow, they didn't see a deformed child. They saw proof of what everyone had whispered for years. The bloodline was twisted, and now the evidence could no longer be denied. That night was remembered not for the storm, not for the silence, but for the child who should not have survived. A child who marked the beginning of a story that America itself has tried to bury. But the question remains, was she truly a curse or a warning? To understand the child without a face, one must step backward, deep into the hills where the family's story began. Records, though sparse, sketch a haunting pattern. Handwritten church ledgers list marriages not between strangers, but between blood. Cousins bound to cousins. Uncles taking nieces. The same few surnames repeating endlessly, etched into fading ink and weather-worn gravestones. The family's name, though avoided in polite conversation, appears over and over in the county's oldest documents. In the cemetery on the ridge, markers lean at odd angles, their inscriptions nearly identical, the same surname carved dozens of times. To outsiders it looked like legacy. To those who lived nearby it was a prison, one the family built for itself. Locals whispered of a patriarch who ruled with absolute authority. He forbade outsiders from entering their circle. Marriage was not a choice, it was an edict. Girls came of age only to be promised to men whose faces looked far too much like their own fathers and brothers. To question was to betray blood. And in these hills, betrayal was met with silence or disappearance. Isolation had once been a necessity. Roads were impassable in winter, markets too distant for survival. But necessity hardened into something darker. What began as survival became obsession. The patriarch insisted that outsiders brought weakness, that purity lay in keeping the bloodline closed. Over decades, the family folded inward, generation after generation, until what remained was less a tree than a tangled knot of branches. The cost of that obsession was not spoken of aloud. But neighbors saw it. Children born sickly, some not living past infancy. Faces that bore a strange sameness, wide-set eyes, pale skin, thin jaws, and occasionally something worse. A baby born unable to walk, another who never spoke a word. each tragedy dismissed as God's will. But the child without a face was different. She was not dismissed. She was feared. For she was the most visible, undeniable proof of what the family's lineage had become. Historians who later examined the region noted the pattern all too clearly. A genealogist from the state archives once remarked that tracing the family tree was like chasing its own tail. It never spread, only circled. Every record pointed back to the same few households, locked in an endless cycle. Neighbors told their children never to wander too close to the family's land. Some recalled hearing laughter echoing from the farmhouse at odd hours, laughter that seemed strained, too loud, as though masking something else. Others swore they saw figures moving by candlelight long after midnight, as if the family only came alive when the rest of the hollow slept. The patriarch's obsession with keeping the bloodline pure created its cruelest legacy, a child born without the very features that defined humanity. The question that haunts these hills even now is simple, yet chilling. Was she the first of her kind, or merely the one no one could hide? The farmhouse stood on a slope, its paint peeling, its windows dark even in the heat of summer. Neighbors began to notice how still it had become. No children's voices echoed from the yard. No smoke curled from the chimney at dawn. The hollow seemed swallowed by its own silence. Curtains were always drawn tight, yellowed lace pressed against glass. Outsiders who approached claimed the doors never opened except for the patriarch himself. A local woman, who once carried bread to the family, recalled being turned away at the porch. She never saw the child, but she remembered a smell, sour, like damp cloth and sickness, seeping through the cracks of the door. One neighbor whispered that there was a baby you couldn't look at. She refused to describe more, her face tightening as though words alone could summon the memory. Others said they caught only a glimpse, a bundle clutched tightly to the mother's chest, its face hidden beneath cloth. The cries were faint, muffled. Then, over time, even the cries stopped. Doctors never came. The county physician confirmed he had no record of being called to the property. Midwives who once served the valley swore their services were refused. Instead, the family turned inward, handling births, deaths, and everything between on their own. Official documents vanished. No birth certificate was filed. No baptism was recorded in the church ledger. In the eyes of the state, no such child existed. But the hollow told a different story. The absence of record only fueled the rumors. School children dared one another to walk the ridge past the farmhouse, claiming they could hear whispers through the trees. Some insisted the baby had been locked away. Others swore she had died, and that the family buried her beneath the floorboards to hide their shame. A county clerk, interviewed years later, remembered opening a folder on the family only to find pages missing. Someone had gone through it, she said, like they didn't want the story written down. And so silence became its own form of evidence. In a community where lives were usually marked by church bells and courthouse filings, the absence of sound and record spoke volumes. It suggested not only secrecy but control. Yet with each year the silence twisted into legend. Travelers told of a faceless child who roamed the woods at night. Hunters claimed they heard soft crying carried on the wind. Even among skeptics there was unease, for everyone agreed that something had happened in that hollow, something carefully hidden. The truth, however, remained trapped inside the farmhouse walls. Only the family knew whether the child still lived, or if the silence was covering a grave. In the hollow, people did not speak of disease or accident. They spoke of curses, not one handed down by God, but one carried in the veins, passed silently from father to daughter, from cousin to cousin. The old women who gathered on porches at dusk whispered of families that twisted in on themselves, each birth revealing what silence and secrecy had done. The girl without eyes and without a nose was not the first child marked by this legacy. Before her, there had been infants born too small, their limbs bent in impossible ways, their jaws crooked as if clenched from birth. Others were born without voices, their mouths moving but no sound emerging. In the shallow cemeteries behind the cabins, small wooden crosses once dotted the ground, most without names. A neighbor remembered seeing them rot away, each grave unmarked, each life forgotten. Folklore filled the gaps where records did not exist. Some claimed the land itself was poisoned, that the hills carried a sickness in the soil, but those who lived closer, who knew the family's ways, understood it differently. "It wasn't the land," one elderly man muttered decades later. "It was the blood." They kept folding it over itself until it couldn't hold anymore. The girl became a symbol, not of tragedy, but of warning. Her presence was a living reminder of what happens when a bloodline circles endlessly, closing itself off from the world outside. Children dared one another to walk past the farmhouse at night, whispering that if you stared too long into the windows, you would see her, the faceless, watching, and yet for the family, she was not shame but prophecy. Witnesses recalled hearing the patriarch preach that her birth was the mark of chosen blood, proof that outsiders were corrupt and that purity must be kept. In his twisted sermons, deformity was not punishment but devotion etched into flesh. Still, the community could not ignore the pattern. One by one, stories emerged of siblings born sickly, cousins who did not survive childhood, girls who gave birth before their own bodies had fully grown. The family tree was no longer a tree at all. It was a knot, strangling itself. When anthropologists later studied the region, they found traces of this generational toll etched into bone fragments and genetic records. Crooked spines, shallow graves of children, journals hinting at repeated stillbirths that were never investigated. The girl without a face was not an exception. She was the most visible chapter in a long, disturbing lineage. The whispers, however, grew darker. Some claimed the curse would not stop with her, that every child to come would carry a heavier mark, that the hollow itself had become a prison where generations could not escape the weight of their own blood. And as the old women warned, once such a curse takes root, it does not die. It waits patient inside the next child. It began not with police, not with doctors, but with a rumor that refused to die. By the late 1970s, whispers of the girl with no face had drifted far beyond the hollow. Travelers repeated the story in roadside diners. Drifters spoke of a child hidden away, a family shrouded in secrecy. And eventually, the story caught the attention of journalists who specialized in America's forgotten places. Two men arrived first. Their car rattled along the gravel backroads, dust curling up behind them like smoke. They were not welcome. At every turn, locals shook their heads, tightened their lips, and warned, best not to ask about that family. But investigators know that silence is not denial, it is confirmation. They began in the churchyard, a small white building sagging under years of neglect. There, among rotting hymnals and weather-warped pews, they found what remained of a Bible. Its pages were half-burned, blackened along the edges. But scrawled in the margins were names. Some crossed out, others circled. Dates of births that did not appear in county records. Dates of deaths that no cemetery listed. From there they searched abandoned homes along the ridge. In one, inside a trunk hidden beneath quilts, they discovered faded photographs. Most were ordinary. Children gathered on porches, mothers holding infants, men standing with rifles. But across many of the faces, a knife had carved deep scratches, gouging out the eyes and mouths. Someone had tried to erase the people from their own history. Still, none of this proved the girl existed, until they met him. An old man, gaunt and weathered, agreed to speak, but only once and only off camera. His voice trembled not from age but from fear. "The stories are true," he admitted. "She lived here. She lived, and she died young." He refused to say her name if she had one, but he described her, a child who rarely left her room, who made no sound when she walked. Neighbors knew when she was near because dogs would howl, their cries sharp and panicked. "She wasn't a monster," he whispered. "She was just not right." And they kept her hidden until the end. The journalist pressed further. "What end? How did she die?" He would not answer. Instead, he pointed toward the tree line, to a stretch of forest where the soil had been disturbed many times. "You'll find nothing now," he said. They made sure of it. When investigators returned with cameras the next day, the man's cabin was empty. Doors left wide open, rocking chair still swaying. Locals told them he had gone visiting, but no one ever saw him again. What remained were fragments, burned scripture, erased faces, and one trembling testimony. Enough to prove something had happened, but not enough to explain what. And so the question deepened. Who buried the girl with no face? And why had her story been left to rot in silence for decades? The investigators left with more evidence than they expected, and yet far less than they needed. Because sometimes the truth isn't hidden in documents or graves. Sometimes it is hidden in the people who refuse to speak. The Hollow was not an exception. It was a pattern, a thread woven into the fabric of rural America, where valleys and backroads concealed stories no official record would ever dare to keep. Historians who dug into these places found striking similarities. Isolated towns where surnames repeated like echoes, places where outsiders were distrusted, and the world beyond the ridgeline might as well have been another planet. Poverty bred secrecy, secrecy bred superstition, and superstition bred horrors no one wanted to name. Dr. Lawrence McBride, our cultural anthropologist, described it bluntly. America has always had its hidden tribes, families that close themselves off, creating their own rules, their own punishments. What we see in these forgotten places isn't just neglect. It's survival turned inward, until it collapses in on itself. Case files revealed it wasn't just the faceless girl. In Appalachia, records surfaced of a boy born without eyes, kept locked in a shed until he starved. In the Midwest, whispers of children with twisted spines buried behind barns. In Kentucky, neighbors spoke of a girl who grew to adulthood without ever speaking a word, a human ghost haunting her own family home. Each story was denied by officials, dismissed as folklore or erased by the passage of time. Yet the patterns remained: silence, concealment, vanished records, and, most chilling of all, communities that conspired not to protect the children, but to protect the families from shame. The Hollow's faceless child was not a legend standing alone. She was part of a chain of tragedies scattered across America's backroads, a chain forged from the same links: isolation, generational fear, and an obsession with keeping bloodlines pure. Old women in one West Virginia town called it a curse. Men whispered that God had marked those families for their sins. But scholars saw something different, not divine punishment but human consequence. Centuries of cousin marrying cousin, of refusing outsiders, of fearing contamination more than disease. The result was not purity but deformity, and yet these children, born twisted, born different, were rarely seen as victims. They became symbols, warnings, living proof of what happened when families coiled too tightly into themselves. For every faceless girl, there were countless others whose names were never spoken, whose graves were never marked. Their stories ended not in headlines, but in shallow soil and fading whispers. What makes the Hollow's tragedy so haunting is not that it was unique, but that it was ordinary. A reflection of something larger, darker, the hidden underside of American history that no textbook records. One investigator put it simply: if you think the Hollow was the only place, you haven't been paying attention. But if these stories stretched across states, across generations, one question remains: how many children, how many faceless girls and voiceless boys were buried long before anyone thought to ask? The Hollow was not the beginning. It was just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle America has never been willing to solve. The Hollow never forgot her. Even decades later, when most who had lived through that night were gone, whispers of the faceless child clung to the valley like fog. Each account was fractured, uncertain, but all of them carried the same uneasy weight. One woman, who had been a girl herself when the child was born, told investigators, "I never once heard her cry. Not once. Babies cry, they scream. But not her. There was only silence and sometimes a sound like a wheeze, like air trying to push through wood that had already rotted." She crossed herself as she spoke, refusing to say the child's name, as if even speaking of her would invite something back. Others remembered differently. A farmer swore he had seen her only once. It was summer, the air heavy with the smell of wet hay. He passed by the farmhouse at dusk and claimed he saw a shape on the porch. She was wrapped up in a shawl, still as stone, he said. But I'll never forget it. There were no eyes looking back. Just nothing. A face that wasn't a face. Some insisted she was hidden entirely, a ghost that existed only behind curtains and locked doors. One man, whose father had traded livestock with the family, told a story passed down. They said she breathed like the wind in a broken barn. You could hear it before you saw her. A rattling sound, low and hollow. That's how they knew where she was in the house. Not by crying, not by laughter, but by that breathing. But memory is slippery. For every account that painted her as silent, another described faint noises. a muffled moan, a rasping sigh. And for every villager who claimed she had lived for years, another whispered that she had died within months. The truth dissolved into rumor, rumor into legend. Still, one fact persisted: nobody could forget her. Children growing up in the hollow dared each other to peek into the abandoned house where she was said to have lived. Some swore they saw shadows moving behind the curtains long after the family was gone. Others claimed that if you stood outside on a windy night, you could hear the rasp of her breath in the hollow boards of the porch. Her existence blurred the line between human and myth. Was she a child born of flesh and blood, or had she become a phantom kept alive only by memory and fear? The investigators who came decades later gathered these fragments, but even they admitted the stories resisted coherence. Each detail contradicted the next, yet together they formed something chilling. The image of a child too disturbing to be remembered clearly, too haunting to ever be forgotten. And so in the hollow, her story lived on, not through documents or graves, but through whispers carried by those who swore they had heard her, seen her or felt her presence just beyond the porch light. But one witness, an old man near his death, revealed something more, something darker. He claimed he not only saw her, he touched her. His words would send a chill through anyone who listened. The hollow devoured its own. Where once the family's barns had stood, proud though weathered, only collapsed beams remained. Roofs caved under decades of storms. Chimneys cracked and leaned like crooked teeth. The farmhouse itself, once the center of whispered horror, sagged into the earth, its windows broken, its doors hanging loose, as if the house had finally exhaled its last breath. Neighbors recalled watching the decline with a mixture of pity and dread. One man, now elderly, described how the family just thinned out. First the children stopped playing in the fields. Then the smoke stopped rising from the chimney. One day the house wasn't a home anymore. It was just a carcass. The family line, built on secrecy and silence, fractured from within. Those who survived either married into distant relatives or vanished from record entirely. The patriarch who once forbade outsiders left nothing behind but rumors. It was as if the bloodline, cursed by its own choices, had decided to erase itself. Decades later, when the land was little more than overgrown fields, investigators stepped into the ruins. Their boots cracked against broken glass and splintered wood. Beneath the rubble of a collapsed barn, they unearthed something more sinister than decay: bones. Small, fragile bones, scattered and mingled with the remains of animals long dead. The discovery sent a ripple of unease through the community, reviving the old story of the faceless girl. Among the dirt, half buried beneath years of soil and rain, lay a single child's shoe. Its leather was torn, the buckle rusted, but its size was unmistakable, too small for any adult. Investigators paused, staring at it in silence, as if the shoe itself was asking a question no one dared to answer. Were these the remains of livestock buried without care? Or had the hollow given up evidence of something darker? Forensic analysis was never conclusive. The bones were too eroded, too intermingled with other remains to separate. And so the mystery deepened. Some locals believed the shoe was hers, proof that the child with no eyes and no nose had once walked, or been carried, across that very ground. Others insisted the family had destroyed every trace of her before fleeing, burying the past not in coffins, but in fire and secrecy. An old woman whispered to journalists that she remembered a night of smoke. She claimed she saw flames rising from the farm's back field and heard the screams of animals. But not just animals. It was higher pitched, she said. Like a child, but it didn't sound right. It sounded wrong. The ruins offered no clarity, only more shadows. Every artifact became a fragment of a puzzle that refused to assemble. Bones with no names, a shoe with no owner. A family erased not by time but by choice. And yet one chilling question remained unanswered. Was the faceless child buried in the dirt of the hollow? Or was she hidden somewhere still, waiting to be found? The line between truth and legend had blurred long before the farmhouse collapsed. By the time investigators pieced through the ruins, the girl without eyes or a nose was no longer just a child. She was a story, retold in whispers, reshaped by fear. Some claimed she had never existed. That the tale was a cruel invention, a ghost story meant to keep children from wandering too far into the hollow. But others swore she was real. And they carried memories too sharp, too chilling to be dismissed as myth. Police records from nearby towns added fuel to the unease. Scattered reports described strange children seen wandering the back roads at dusk, children who avoided eye contact, children who never spoke. One deputy, now retired, recalled stopping a boy on the roadside in the early 1970s. The boy's face, he said, carried a look I can't forget. His eyes were wide apart, his jaw twisted, like something wasn't finished. By the time backup arrived, the boy had vanished into the trees. Elders in the region told similar stories. They believed descendants of the family still walked among them, blending into nearby towns, but never fully escaping the bloodline's mark. At church gatherings, whispers spread about children with uncanny features, an ear set too low, a mouth that seemed off-center, a silence that clung to them like shadow. "You can tell," one old man insisted. "You can always tell when they're one of hers," and yet skeptics scoffed. They argued that poverty and isolation bred deformities, yes, but nothing more. To them, the faceless girl was an invention, a symbol of rural superstition, inflated over generations. Local folklore, nothing else, but the silence of the family itself raised doubts. Birth records were missing, death records incomplete. Photographs, when found, bore scratches across faces. Every absence became an echo, every missing piece an invitation for belief. A folklorist who visited the Hollow in the late 1990s described the atmosphere as heavy, almost mournful. He collected stories from townspeople, compiling them into a journal. In it, he wrote, "Folklore does not grow from nothing. It grows from something too disturbing to face directly. Legends are truths we bury alive. To this day, no definitive proof has surfaced, no coffin, no death certificate, no unmarked grave that could be tied to her name, if she ever had one. The girl without eyes remains caught between worlds, too detailed to be dismissed, too elusive to be proven, and perhaps that is why her story endures. Because folklore thrives in the silence left behind by fact. Because in the dark corners of rural America, where records rot and families vanish, truth and myth often become indistinguishable. But one question still lingers, unanswered and unsettling. If she was only a story, then why do her descendants still walk among us? Toaster. Her name never entered the ledgers of birth or death. No church bell rang in her memory. No certificate sealed her existence. If she was ever buried, her grave was left without a marker, swallowed by weeds and rain. Yet the silence she left behind has grown louder with each passing generation. Neighbors, decades later, still whispered about the girl they were forbidden to mention. They remembered the way her family avoided questions, how visitors were kept at a distance, how laughter was absent from that lonely house. To some, she was a ghost long before she disappeared, a presence hidden behind boarded windows, heard only in muffled cries that carried through thin night air. One farmer swore he saw a small mound at the edge of the woods, freshly covered with soil, though no funeral had been held. Another recalled the mother's hands, cracked from farm work, trembling as if she carried a weight too heavy for a child to bear. But none of them spoke publicly. Fear kept their lips sealed. Fear and shame, because what the girl represented was not just tragedy, it was corruption. The kind that doesn't come from outsiders but from bloodlines. Isolation had turned kin into captors, protectors into predators. And in a land where religion and respectability were paraded in daylight, the darkest sins were tucked away at night. Her story, whether folklore or fact, was passed on like a curse. Children growing up in the valley would hear it whispered as a warning. Don't wander too far. Don't ask too many questions. Don't trust the silence. Parents dismissed it as rumor, but deep down they knew. In every family tree there are branches that rot in secret. Investigators, years later, tried to piece together fragments. They looked for records but found only gaps. No doctor had signed her birth. No school had called her name. No church had written her into baptism. She was officially invisible. And that was the most chilling truth of all, that a child could live, suffer, and vanish without leaving a trace in America's own archives. Perhaps the cruelest part is not knowing. Was she buried under the house, as some whispered? Did her cries echo until they were silenced forever? Or does her blood still flow in the veins of those who walk freely today, unknowing heirs to a hidden crime? What remains is not her face nor her name, but her absence, a hollow space carved into the memory of a community that chose silence over justice. Silence, after all, is safer. Silence protects the guilty, and so the faceless girl became a symbol, not of one crime, but of countless others buried in unmarked graves, erased from records, erased from history. A symbol of how quickly innocence can be consumed when a society values reputation over truth. Her grave may be unmarked, her name may be lost, but the land still holds her silence. And silence, as history proves, is never empty. It is heavy, it is haunting, and it never lets go.